Ghost Village. Whispers of the blind boy's curse. A chilling legend unravels in a cursed village where ancient sins return to haunt the living. An impoverished blind beggar stumbles into the village at dusk, only to become the victim of cruelty and neglect. But as his lifeless body is discarded, an unholy force awakens. The village spirals into a series of terrifying events. Crops rot, livestock vanish, and the local temple is mysteriously burned to the ground. Guilt and superstition grip the villagers as they realize their actions have summoned something malevolent. A local elder struggles to save the village, but the horrifying truth lies buried within the beggar's spirit, a revengeful curse that spares no one. The terrifying tale crescendos into an unforgettable climax as the line between the living and the dead shatters. Part 1. The Forest Encounter. The sun hung low in the sky, its fiery light sinking into the jagged horizon, leaving the world cloaked in a heavy, bruised darkness. The forest swallowed the faint light entirely. Each step John and Sam took muffled by the thick carpet of decaying leaves and shadows that grew longer by the second. An icy breeze whispered through the dense, ancient trees, carrying a faint scent of rot and something indescribable, something wrong. John, an elderly teacher with a head of graying hair and the weight of years in his posture, walked briskly along the narrow path. Sam, we need to hurry. This forest. It isn't safe after dark. Sam, barely 14, trudged behind him, eyes darting to every rustle in the underbrush. What do you mean, sir? It's just a forest. John paused for the briefest of moments, his lantern casting a jittering glow on his worn face. The villagers say it's cursed. That's all. Stories to frighten children. His voice held no conviction. The words lingered uncomfortably in the cold air as they pressed on. Trees loomed overhead like watchful sentinels, their twisted branches reaching out as if to snatch the unwary. The path narrowed, forcing John to clutch the lantern closer, its pale flame flickering wildly against the wind. Then it happened. A sound broke the eerie silence, soft, ragged breathing. John froze, holding his arm out to stop Sam. Did you hear that? He whispered, his voice a tremor of unease. Sam nodded, wide-eyed. Is someone there? The breathing grew louder, shallow, desperate. A faint shuffling followed, like someone dragging their feet through the earth. John turned sharply, the lantern's light spilling to the left, casting eerie shadows. Who's there? He called, his voice firm but uncertain. From behind a massive oak tree, a figure emerged. It moved slowly, hesitantly, as though unsure whether to approach. John's breath hitched in his throat when he saw it, a small boy, barely 10, dressed in filthy rags that hung from his frail frame like skin on bone. His face was ghostly pale, streaked with mud and dried blood, and his milky white eyes lifeless, unseeing, stared blankly ahead. A cane clutched in his trembling hand tapped feebly against the ground. Please, the boy whispered, his voice barely audible, as though dragged from some deep, empty place. His lips quivered, and his breathing came in weak, rattling gasps. Help me, Sam recoiled instinctively, his hand gripping John's coat sleeve. Sir, something's wrong with him. He's not. John hushed him, though his own hand shook slightly. It's just a child. Sam, he bent down slowly, lantern held high to see better. Boy, where are your parents? What are you doing here alone? The boy swayed on his feet, his thin body visibly trembling from the cold or exhaustion or perhaps something else. His cracked lips moved again. No one left. His cane slipped from his weak grasp, and he fell to his knees. I can't. John's heart wrenched. Compassion, worn into his bones after decades of teaching, overrode his fear. Good Lord, he's blind. Sam, help me, sir, we shouldn't. Sam protested, his voice high and panicked. There's something strange about him. We don't know who he is. John shot him a sharp look, masking his own unease. Sam, he's just a child, and he'll die out here if we leave him. Do you want that on your conscience? Reluctantly, Sam helped as John lifted the frail boy to his feet. The child's weight was barely there, his bones sharp beneath his skin. John tried not to shudder as he gripped the boy's cold, clammy arms. We're taking you to the village, he said softly. They'll know how to help you. The boy didn't respond, his lifeless eyes staring at nothing. Yet he seemed to cling to John with a strange desperation. The forest path stretched endlessly as they made their way toward the village. Sam lagged behind, darting nervous glances at the boy who shuffled between them, his bare feet dragging against the dirt. He didn't speak, only releasing the occasional whimper or sigh. John tried to distract himself from the growing sense of dread curling in his chest. "What's your name, son?" he asked gently. The boy remained silent. John frowned, slowing his pace. "Boy?" "I asked your name at last," the boy spoke, his voice a hoarse whisper, barely carried by the wind. They called me Thomas." John's voice softened with relief, though something about the way the boy said his name, like reciting a word long forgotten, sent a chill up his spine. The forest grew darker, the air colder. The lantern flickered dangerously low, as though something unseen were trying to snuff it out. Sam tugged on John's sleeve again, his voice a trembling whisper. "Sir." He's smiling. John turned sharply. The boy's face was still downturned, his blank eyes staring at the ground, but yes, his cracked lips were pulled into the faintest, unsettling smile. John's heart thundered in his chest, but he forced himself to keep walking. "It's just the cold, Sam." "Keep moving." The boy let out a soft, wheezing laugh that didn't sound like it belonged to him. "You will all pay." John stopped dead in his tracks. "What did you say?" The boy's face remained downturned, but his voice rang out clearer now, though guttural and deep, like something speaking through him. "They let me die. They let me suffer. You will all pay." John dropped the boy's arm, stumbling backward. "Who let you die?" "What are you talking about?" The boy's smile widened ever so slightly, his teeth stained and jagged, as he turned his head to look at John with those unseeing eyes. From behind, Sam screamed. John whipped around to see Sam's lantern had fallen to the ground, its flame extinguished. The shadows had grown impossibly dark, stretching from the trees to where the boy stood, his small figure almost blending into them. "Sir," Sam cried, his voice strangled with terror. It's not a boy, it's something else." "Enough," John snapped, though his own voice wavered. "It's just a frightened child." But when he turned back, Thomas was gone. The forest stood still, deathly silent, except for the faint sound of something dragging across the dirt deeper into the shadows. Sam was frozen in place, his pale face streaked with tears. "He's gone, sir. He just disappeared." John swallowed hard, scanning the forest with the flickering remnants of their light. "He couldn't have gone far. Thomas, where are you?" Silence. For a moment, the forest seemed to breathe around them, its branches creaking as though shifting closer. And then softly, just behind them, came the sound of laughter. Not a child's laughter. Something older, darker, and hollow. "Run," John whispered, his face drained of color. "Sam, run together." They bolted down the forest path, the shadows clawing at their heels. The wind screamed through the trees, carrying with it the faint voice of the boy. "You will all pay." By the time the village lights flickered on the horizon, John collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. Sam fell beside him, crying, "Sir." "What was that?" John didn't answer. He stared back at the forest, where the shadows now seemed unnaturally still. The boy was gone, or so it seemed, but his final words echoed in John's mind. A chilling promise. You will all pay. And though the village lay before them, safe and familiar, John couldn't shake the feeling that someone had followed them out of the forest. Part 2. The village's cruelty. The village sat on the edge of the forest like a forgotten scar on the land, its narrow dirt paths snaking between crooked houses and broken fences. Evening had fallen, and the village square bustled with tired workers returning from the fields. Fires crackled in clay ovens, casting dancing shadows on walls, and the scent of cooking mingled with the cold, damp air. John gripped the frail boy Thomas by the arm as they stepped into the square. Sam followed a few paces behind, silent, glancing nervously at the villagers who turned to stare. The murmurs began almost immediately. "Who's that?" a woman muttered to her neighbor, her voice sharp with suspicion. "A beggar? Look at him, filthy, probably some cursed soul wandering from the forest," another man spat, narrowing his eyes. We don't need his kind here. John straightened his back, his voice calm yet firm as he addressed the growing crowd. This boy was alone in the woods. He's blind and starving. He needs help. Does anyone know where he might have come from? The villagers didn't move. Their eyes lingered on Thomas, who clung to John's coat, his milky white gaze unsettling in the flickering light. A tall man pushed his way to the front of the crowd. His name was Edward, a cruel farmer known for his short temper. Why should we care? He demanded, his lips curling in disdain. He's not one of ours. Look at him, skin and bones. He's as good as dead already. He's just a child, John snapped, anger bubbling beneath his measured tone. Have you no compassion? Edward scoffed, stepping closer. Compassion? For him, his beady eyes settled on Thomas, whose frail frame shivered from the cold. You can't fool us. Kids like that don't just wander out of nowhere. He reeks of the forest. The word hung heavily in the air. The forest. The villagers stiffened, as though an invisible wind had passed through them. It was no secret that they feared the dark woods and the whispers that came from its depths. Stories of spirits, curses, and unholy things thrived in the village, passed down like warnings etched into their souls. He's blind and alone, John repeated desperately. He's no threat to you, but Edward sneered and suddenly lunged forward, ripping the cane from Thomas's grasp. If he's so harmless, let him stand on his own. No, John shouted, but it was too late. Edward tossed the cane behind him, and it clattered against the stones, out of Thomas's reach. The boy gasped, stumbling forward, his trembling hands reaching into the darkness. My cane, his voice cracked, small and broken. Please. I can't. The crowd laughed cruelly. Women covered their mouths, men jeered, and children pointed, their shrill voices mocking. Look at him, crawling like a rat. John stepped forward, his face red with fury. Stop this. Have you no shame? But the crowd didn't care. Another man, this one younger, with rough hands and a cruel smile, shoved Thomas roughly from behind. The boy pitched forward, landing hard on the ground. His bony knees scraped against the dirt, his hands clawing uselessly at the stones. Blood oozed from fresh cuts, painting his pale skin crimson. Get up, blind boy, someone shouted. Can't you see? Oh wait, he can't, another cackled. Thomas didn't move. He stayed on his hands and knees, his breathing ragged and slow, as though each inhale hurt more than the last. Tears mixed with the blood on his face, carving tiny rivers of despair through the dirt. John's hands shook as he bent to help the boy, only to be yanked back by Edward. Leave him, Edward growled, his voice low and venomous. You bring him into our village like he's one of us, but he doesn't belong here. You should have left him where you found him, you're cowards, John shouted, his voice cracking with anger and desperation. He's just a child, a human being. Is this how you treat the weak? But the villagers ignored him. Thomas's frail body curled inward, his trembling hands pressing against his chest as if he were trying to hold himself together. The laughter around him grew louder, harsher, until Thomas finally whispered, barely loud enough to be heard. You! The crowd fell silent. The word was soft, but it rang through the square like a death knell. Edward frowned, taking a step back. What did you say? Thomas's head lifted slightly, though his blank eyes remained fixed on the ground. His voice, trembling but steady, filled the air like frost creeping into a room. You will all pay. The villagers froze, their faces draining of color. A chill crawled through the square, as though the temperature had dropped suddenly. Thomas's cracked lips twisted into something resembling a smile, but it was empty, devoid of innocence. John's heart pounded in his chest. Thomas. No, don't. The boy's voice rose again, stronger this time, his frail body still hunched on the ground. They let me die. They let me suffer. The villagers stared, unblinking. The wind, cold and unnatural, gusted through the square, extinguishing several lanterns. Shadows seemed to crawl from the corners, inching closer. Edward took another step back, his bravado gone. What is this? And then, as suddenly as it began, Thomas fell silent. His body swayed once, then collapsed fully onto the cold earth. His chest no longer rose. His hands lay limp at his sides. For a long moment, no one moved. John dropped to his knees beside the boy, his trembling hands searching for a pulse. "Thomas?" "Thomas," he called desperately, but there was no response. The boy's skin had already turned cold. Edward broke the silence with a scoff, though his voice was strained. The brat was sick. He was going to die anyway. But no one else spoke. The villagers stared at the lifeless body, their faces pale, their earlier jeers replaced with silent unease. The wind still carried that unnatural chill, and though no one said it aloud, they all felt it. The boy's final words echoed in their ears like a curse etched into the night. "You will all pay." John stood slowly, his hands shaking as he looked at the villagers. "You did this," he said hoarsely. "You treated him like an animal. And now something terrible will come of this." Edward's face darkened, though he couldn't meet John's gaze. "Don't talk nonsense. He's dead." That's the end of it, but deep down, everyone knew it wasn't. The crowd dispersed slowly, the laughter long gone. No one dared look at the body again. John remained behind, standing over Thomas's small frame. Sam finally stepped forward, his voice barely a whisper. "Sir, what's going to happen now?" John didn't answer. He simply knelt beside the boy, his heart heavy with guilt and dread. The villagers' cruelty had carved a hole into the night, and something darker, something ancient had filled it. As John stood to leave, a sound made him freeze. It was faint, coming from nowhere and everywhere all at once, a slow, breathy laugh. And though the boy's body remained still, the echo of his voice whispered again, soft and chilling, carried on the wind. "You will all pay." John turned sharply, his lantern flickering weakly, but there was no one there. Only shadows stretching long across the ground, as though reaching for something unseen. The night had grown darker than it should have. Part 3. The Buried Secret. The village square was silent the following morning, though the events of the night lingered like an unshakable shadow. The air, once crisp and fresh with dawn, felt thick and stale like it hadn't moved in centuries. The villagers had gathered again, but this time there were no jeers, no laughter. Only tense murmurs and sideways glances like children trying to avoid a punishment they knew was coming. Thomas's lifeless body still lay where he had fallen, his small frame curled unnaturally on the cold ground. His blind, unseeing eyes had been shut, but somehow, it didn't feel like peace. It felt as though he was waiting. Edward was the first to break the silence. "We need to get rid of him. Bury him somewhere far from here." "Far from here," a woman hissed. "What if he comes back? What if enough?" Edward barked, his voice sharp but hollow. "He's just a body now, dead and gone. The rest of you are acting like frightened children." His words carried little conviction. His eyes betrayed him, darting nervously toward the boy's body as if expecting it to rise. John, who had watched the villagers from the edge of the square, shook his head in disgust. "Have you no shame?" Edward shot him a venomous glare. "He's dead because he was sick, weak, and cursed. We didn't kill him." John stepped forward, his voice shaking with anger. "He died because you showed him no mercy. A child begged for help, and you spat on him. You shoved him to the ground like he was less than nothing." The crowd shifted uneasily. No one dared look John in the eye. "We'll bury him," Edward growled, ignoring John's words. "Quickly." Near the old well, the crowd murmured their reluctant agreement. The old well sat at the far edge of the village, neglected for decades. Its stone walls had cracked and crumbled, and the water beneath was long rumored to be cursed, stagnant, dark, and lifeless. Two men dragged Thomas's body through the dirt on an old, tattered sheet, his limp form leaving faint trails of blood and dust across the stones. The sound was unbearable to John, each scrape of fabric like a dagger in his ears. He followed silently, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. Sam trailed behind him, his face pale and drawn, clutching his teacher's coat. The procession reached the well. The wind had died, leaving the air suffocating and still. Edward, holding a shovel, glanced back at the crowd. "We'll dig here. No marker, no fuss. "It's better this way," the villagers nodded. None of them wanted to linger, yet no one dared walk away. The men dug quickly, their shovels biting into the earth with grim determination. John stood at the edge, watching the boy's small, still body as it lay beside the well. He couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas was somehow watching them, too watching and listening. "Why here?" John finally asked, his voice low. Edward paused, sweat dripping down his brow. "The well's been dry for years. No one comes here. It's better to bury him where no one will step on the grave. Or is it because you're afraid?" John pressed, his eyes narrowing. "Afraid to bury him closer to your homes?" Edward's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he stabbed the shovel into the earth harder. After what felt like an eternity, the hole was already shallow, uneven, and rushed. "That's enough," Edward grunted. "Get it over with." The two men lifted Thomas's body by the sheet, lowering him into the grave. The boy's small figure disappeared into the shadows, swallowed by the earth. John knelt at the edge, murmuring a prayer under his breath. "Rest now, child. May you find peace in death that was denied to you in life," Edward snorted, shoveling dirt over the body with angry, jerking motions. "Enough prayers. He's dead. He won't hear you." The villagers watched silently as dirt filled the grave, covering the boy completely. It was over within minutes. Someone muttered that they should leave, but no one moved. They stared at the patch of earth, at the small mound that seemed to pulse with something unseen. Then came the chill. It started as a faint breath of cold air that snaked its way between the villagers' feet. Then it grew stronger, like icy fingers crawling up their spines. The temperature dropped so quickly it stole the air from their lungs. "Is it the wind?" someone whispered. But there was no wind. The trees stood still, their bare branches like skeletal arms clawing at the gray sky. Even the birds had fallen silent. Edward stopped mid-shovel, his hands trembling. "Let's go," he muttered, his voice strained. "There's nothing more to do here." The crowd broke apart, fleeing back toward the village as if they couldn't bear to stand a moment longer. John lingered behind, his eyes fixed on the grave. He could feel it, an unnatural stillness in the air, thick as tar, pressing against his chest. Sam tugged on his sleeve. "Sir." "Something's wrong, I know," Sam John whispered, finally turning to leave. "I know." By the time they returned to the village, the sun had disappeared behind heavy clouds, casting everything into a muted gray. The villagers went about their routines in forced silence, as though afraid to speak too loudly. Doors shut quickly. Curtains were drawn. It wasn't long before the first signs appeared. The air in the village remained unnaturally cold, even as the fires burned brightly. People wrapped themselves in extra layers, shivering as though winter had come early. Then came the sounds. At first they were faint, soft whispers, like someone muttering just beyond the edge of hearing. Children complained of footsteps outside their windows at night. Dogs howled, their cries echoing like warnings into the empty streets. In the homes closest to the well, things were worse. An elderly woman swore she saw a shadow moving in her kitchen, though no one else was there. A farmer awoke to the sound of tapping on his door, only to find no one outside. "What's happening to us?" the villagers murmured to one another, their voices tinged with fear. They tried to dismiss it all as coincidence, but their eyes betrayed the truth. They were terrified. John sat in his small house near the square, staring into the flames of his hearth. Sam sat close by, hugging his knees. "Sir," he whispered, "do you think it's—" The boy John didn't answer right away. The truth sat heavy on his chest. He could feel it, whatever they had buried at the well. It wasn't resting. Finally, he looked at Sam and said softly, "I don't know, but we should pray, Sam. Pray for the village outside." The unnatural chill deepened. The night grew longer and darker than it ever had before. At the edge of the village, where the well lay hidden among the weeds, the earth remained undisturbed, the grave silent and still. But if anyone had dared to stand there in the dark and listen, truly listen, they might have heard it. A faint sound, a soft scratching, like fingernails clawing at wood from far beneath the ground. And then, a whisper. "You will all pay." The words carried on the wind, drifting through the village like a curse. And though no one heard them that night, everyone felt them. They felt it in the cold, in the shadows, in the weight of their own guilt pressing down on them like the earth on the boy's grave. The buried secret would not stay buried for long. Part 4. Signs of the curse. The unnatural chill that had settled over the village didn't lift. The sun rose and fell, but its light seemed muted, its warmth lost to some unseen force. The once bustling village now felt like a ghost town, with shadows creeping just a little too far, and the wind carrying whispers that no one dared repeat. The villagers tried to carry on with their lives, avoiding each other's eyes as though afraid to speak of what had happened. But the feeling lingered an unspoken dread that something terrible had been set in motion. It began early one morning with Farmer Reuben. He was a burly, red-faced man who had little time for superstition or idle gossip. His family owned a small farm at the edge of the village, where he kept cows and a few goats to trade milk and cheese in the market. Reuben awoke before dawn, as always, with a stiff groan and the creak of his old bed. Wrapping his thick coat around himself, he grabbed a lantern and trudged into the cold morning air to check on his animals. The frost bit at his cheeks, the kind of cold that sank deep into the bones. The barn was quiet, too quiet. Normally the cows would stir at the sound of his boots on the frozen earth, their low, sleepy grunts greeting him. But today there was only silence. Reuben frowned and held the lantern high as he entered. The light spilled across the wooden stalls, casting long, crooked shadows against the walls. Something was wrong. The air stank of iron, thick, sharp, and unmistakable. Belle, he called softly, walking toward his largest cow. She stood at the back of the barn, unmoving. As he approached, his lantern flickered, and the chill in the barn grew almost unbearable. What in God's name? His voice trailed off as the lantern's light finally revealed the cow. Belle was dead, standing stiffly on her legs, as though frozen in place. Her mouth hung open, her eyes glassy and bulging. And her body, dear Lord, her body was completely drained of blood. The once white fur of her belly had turned a sickly gray, her skin sagging against her ribs like an empty sack. On her neck, 2 small puncture marks glistened in the lantern's glow. Reuben stumbled back, his breath caught in his throat. No, this can't be. A faint sound rippled through the barn, then a whisper. It came from nowhere, but it surrounded him, coiling in his ears. Reuben spun around, holding the lantern aloft, but there was no one there. Only shadows. Only silence. Heart hammering, he turned and fled the barn, leaving the door wide open. He didn't stop running until he burst into the village square, his face pale and slick with sweat. By midday, everyone in the village had heard about the cow. Whispers rippled through the crowds like wildfire, the word curse hanging in the air. It's him, someone muttered. The boy, nonsense, Edward barked, though his voice lacked its usual bite. Cows die all the time. A sickness, that's all. John overheard and stepped forward. A sickness doesn't drain a cow of blood, Edward. And you know what? Edward turned on him, his face red with anger or fear. It's nothing. You and your superstitions are poisoning this village. But before John could respond, a chilling gust of wind swept through the square, biting through cloaks and coats like a blade. The villagers shivered, pulling their clothes tighter around themselves. Somewhere in the distance, a dog howled long and mournful. That night, the village temple burned. It began just after midnight, when most of the villagers were fast asleep. John awoke to the sound of frantic shouting and a strange, bright glow outside his window. Throwing on his coat, he hurried into the street, where a crowd had already gathered. The temple, an ancient structure that had stood for generations, was engulfed in flames. The fire roared like a living beast, flames twisting unnaturally high into the air, licking the sky with red and gold tongues. Sparks showered like fiery rain, and thick black smoke curled upward, blotting out the stars. It's burning too fast, someone cried. How did it start? No one knows, another shouted back. It just burst into flames. The villagers scrambled to form a bucket line, hauling water from the well to douse the flames. But no matter how much water they poured, the fire seemed to grow stronger, feeding on something unseen. John watched in horror, as the temple doors, once carved with images of saints and angels, cracked and splintered, collapsing inward. For a moment, he thought he saw something in the fire, a shape, a shadow, a figure standing tall amidst the flames. It was small, child-sized, and its head turned ever so slightly toward him. John's heart seized. No, the flames roared louder, and he stumbled back, shielding his face from the intense heat. The villagers screamed as the fire surged higher, impossibly high, as if trying to devour the entire sky. By dawn, the temple was nothing but ash and smoldering ruins. The villagers stood in stunned silence, their faces pale and hollow, as they stared at the remains. "It's a curse," someone whispered. Edward spun around, his face contorted with anger and fear. "Stop saying that." But the whispers continued, growing louder, passing through the crowd like an infection. "The boy said we would pay. This is our punishment. He's come back." Edward's voice broke as he shouted over them. "It's just a fire. Nothing more," but his words fell on deaf ears. The villagers knew. They could feel it. The air was too cold, the silence too heavy, and the shadows too long. John stood at the edge of the crowd, his gaze fixed on the temple's ruins. The fire had burned unnaturally hot, leaving no trace of the sacred items inside. It was as though something or someone had wanted to erase it completely. Beside him, Sam tugged on his sleeve, his voice small and trembling. "Sir, do you think it's him?" The boy John didn't answer. His mouth was dry, his throat tight. He could still hear the whispers on the wind, the same words the boy had murmured before he died. "You will all pay." That night, no one slept. Doors were bolted shut, and candles burned in windows like silent prayers. Families huddled together, whispering to each other, afraid of the dark. The sounds returned, faint, almost imperceptible. Soft tapping on doors and windows. Footsteps on empty streets. Whispers. Always whispers, drifting through the night air. Some swore they heard a child crying outside their homes, but when they looked, there was no one there. Only the wind. And in the village square, the ground near the old well seemed colder than anywhere else. If anyone had dared to stand there and listen, they might have heard it again, the faint, steady scratching, as though something beneath the earth was trying to claw its way free. The villagers knew, though they wouldn't say it aloud. The curse had begun. Part 5. Whispers in the shadows. The village was no longer the same. Ever since the fire that reduced the temple to ash, an unnatural silence had fallen upon the streets, a silence that swallowed laughter, conversation, and even the sound of the wind. The villagers, their faces drawn and pale, moved like shadows themselves, avoiding eye contact, their heads bent as though afraid to look up. For good reason. It began with the shadows. At first, it was subtle. A child playing near the edge of the village stopped suddenly, eyes wide. "Mama," he whispered, tugging at his mother's sleeve. The shadow moved out. The woman, too tired and too frightened to ask, didn't look where he pointed. "Come inside," she said sharply. No more games today, but as they hurried toward their home, she couldn't shake the feeling of something watching her. Something behind her, just out of sight. By the following evening, the whispers began. They came first to the children. Little ones woke up screaming, their shrill cries piercing through the quiet night. Mothers rushed to their sides, their hands shaking as they held their sobbing children close. "What is it? Tell me what you saw." "A boy," they whispered between shuddering breaths. "A boy with no eyes. He was at my window." The parents would rush to the windows, flinging them open, searching for intruders. But there was no one. Only the darkness, vast and endless, and the wind soft, cold, and unrelenting. John lay awake that same night, staring at the ceiling of his small cottage, his heart pounding in his chest. Sam, curled up on a makeshift bed near the fire, slept fitfully, muttering incoherently under his breath. It was the wind that unsettled John the most. It wasn't the same anymore. It didn't sigh, or howl, or hum. It whispered. Faint, chilling words that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. "You let me die." John sat up sharply, sweat running down the back of his neck. "No," he muttered under his breath. "I didn't let him die." I tried to help." The words echoed back to him. as though the wind had heard and was mocking him. "You let me die." The fire flickered weakly, its light casting strange shadows across the room. John blinked, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, the shadows seemed to move elongating, twisting unnaturally along the walls. Then, in the far corner, something darker than the rest seemed to rise, like a figure struggling to stand. John shot to his feet, knocking over a chair. "Who's there?" The sound jolted Sam awake, and he sat up groggily. "Sir?" "What's wrong?" John's gaze darted to the corner again. The shadows had stilled. The wind outside had gone silent, but the unease in his gut remained, gnawing at his resolve. "It's nothing, Sam. Go back to sleep." He didn't sleep again that night. The disappearances began the next morning. Margaret, a widow who lived alone, was the first to go. Her neighbor found her front door swinging open, the lock shattered, as though someone or something had forced its way in. Inside, the cottage was cold and quiet, with no trace of Margaret except for her slippers near the threshold, as though she had stepped out and never returned. The villagers gathered nervously outside the home, whispering among themselves. "She's gone," someone said. "Vanished." Without a trace, another added. Edward stood at the center of the crowd, his face pale but defiant. "It's nothing," he barked, though his voice wavered. "Margaret probably wandered off." "She was old into the woods," John snapped, stepping forward. With bare feet. "Edward, you think she just walked away on a morning like this?" Edward didn't answer. He didn't have to. Everyone knew the truth. Margaret wasn't the first, and she wouldn't be the last. By the third day, 3 more villagers were gone, disappearing overnight, leaving no sign of struggle except open doors and the cold, unearthly quiet that followed. Those who remained began locking themselves indoors at sundown, barricading windows and muttering prayers long forgotten. The children were forbidden to leave their homes after dark, but still, they saw things they couldn't explain. "Papa," a boy whispered to his father one night, tears streaming down his face. "He's here again." "The boy is outside." The father rushed to the window, flinging it open. The freezing air swept into the room, extinguishing the lantern. The boy screamed, pointing into the darkness. "Don't let him in. Don't let him in." But there was nothing there. Nothing except the faint sound of footsteps, bare feet shuffling across the frozen ground in the wind. The horrible, whispering wind. "You let me die." The man slammed the window shut, his hands trembling. "There's no one there," he whispered to himself. "There's no one there," but he couldn't explain the small handprint, wet and bloody, that remained on the glass. John couldn't ignore it any longer. He sat at the village tavern, surrounded by terrified villagers who clutched their mugs of ale, as though the liquid might offer them some comfort. Sam sat beside him, pale and quiet, his eyes darting nervously to the corners of the room. "It's the boy," someone said suddenly. "The beggar. The one we buried." "Stop," Edward growled, slamming his fist on the table. "It's not a curse. It's..." "What is it then?" Edward. John interrupted, his voice rising. "You still want to call this nothing? People are disappearing. Shadows move on their own. Children see him at their windows. The wind whispers, 'Edward.'" The room fell silent, the villagers staring at John with wide, fearful eyes. Edward stood, his face contorted with rage and denial. "It's just fear. You're all letting fear rot your minds." John slammed his hand on the table. "Then why don't you stay at the well tonight?" "Edward," he challenged. "Why don't you stand by his grave and tell us what you hear?" Edward didn't respond. That night, the whispers grew louder. John sat in his chair, staring at the flickering fire. Sam dozed uneasily on the floor, clutching a blanket tightly. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the voice that refused to let John rest. "You let me die." John squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his hands to his ears, but it didn't help. The voice was inside him now, echoing through his thoughts. Then slowly the fire began to dim. John's eyes snapped open, and his breath caught in his throat. The flames flickered once, then twice, before sputtering out completely, leaving the room in total darkness. A faint noise drifted from the corner, a soft, dragging sound like bare feet on wood. "Sam," John whispered hoarsely. "Sam, wake up." Sam stirred, blinking in the dark. "Sir." The dragging sound grew louder, closer. John's heart thundered as he fumbled for the lantern, striking a match with shaking hands. The flame flared to life, casting a weak light into the room. For a moment, nothing moved. The shadows seemed normal again until John saw it. At the far end of the room, just beyond the reach of the light, a small figure stood. Pale, frail, with empty, unseeing eyes. It was Thomas. The boy smiled, his lips cracked and bloodied, his voice a soft, chilling whisper. "You let me die." John's lantern slipped from his hand, crashing to the floor and extinguishing the light. In the darkness, the boy's whisper rang out again, louder this time. "You let me die." The shadows surged toward them. Sam screamed, and outside the wind howled. Part 6. John's revelation. The darkness in the village deepened with every passing day. The sun barely rose now, a pale, weak light that never seemed to pierce through the thick gray clouds above. The cold was relentless, seeping into bones and minds alike. Fires burned constantly in homes, but no warmth seemed to come from them. And though no one said it aloud, everyone felt that something unnatural had taken hold of their village. The whispers, once faint and fleeting, now echoed clearly in every corner, a chilling reminder of the boy's last words. "You let me die." John sat hunched over a small table in his cottage, his face lit only by the flickering lantern. Dark shadows clung to his features, making him look older, more haggard. A map of the village lay sprawled before him, covered in frantic notes and markings. Sam sat nearby, silent, hugging his knees. He hadn't spoken much in days, haunted by the same terror that gripped the village. "Sam," John murmured, his voice hoarse. "It's growing stronger." Sam looked up, his wide, tired eyes filled with fear. "What is, sir?" John didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared into the flame, as if trying to draw some answer from its wavering light. "The curse," he finally said. "This isn't just vengeance. It's something darker, something that has taken root." Sam swallowed hard. "What do we do?" John stood suddenly, determination blazing in his eyes for the first time in days. "We go to the elders. There's still time." "There must be. If this village has any hope left, we have to act now." The elders of the village, 3 men as old as the hills themselves, gathered in the council hall, a crumbling stone building that smelled of dust and decay. They sat on long benches, their faces drawn and pale. Even the strongest among them looked brittle, as if the curse had begun to eat away at their very spirits. Edward was there too, his face etched with denial and a simmering anger. John stormed into the hall with Sam close behind, slamming the heavy wooden doors shut behind them. The sound echoed like thunder through the room. "What is the meaning of this?" barked one elder, his voice cracking. "We do not summon council meetings in the middle of the night. This is not a normal night." John snapped, his voice a sharp, trembling roar. He looked around the room, his gaze darting between them all. "You've felt it, you've heard it. This village is dying." The elder shifted uneasily. Edward sneered, crossing his arms. "You've lost your mind, John. We're dealing with nothing more than fear. The weak have vanished." John interrupted sharply, cutting him off. "Do you call that fear? Do you call the temple burning to the ground nothing? The children see him. The shadows move. People are disappearing, Edward. Do you think this is some trick of the light?" His words hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. For a moment, no one spoke. Then one of the elders, a frail man named Elias, leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. "What are you suggesting, John?" John's hands trembled as he gripped the back of a chair for support. "A cleansing. A ritual." At this, Edward burst out laughing, though the sound was hollow, desperate. "A ritual. Do you hear yourself? What superstition has taken hold of you?" John turned on him, his face furious and wild. "It's not superstition. You all saw what happened to that boy. We buried him like an animal. We let him suffer. And now, he's here." Elias's eyes darkened. "You believe the boy is Still among us, he's more than that, John replied grimly. He's become something else. His anger, his pain, it's festering, spreading like a disease through the village. We fed it with our cruelty and our fear. Enough of this nonsense, Edward shouted, slamming his hand on the table. We are not performing pagan rituals like savages. We will wait it out. This will pass. John stepped closer to Edward, his voice a low growl. How many more have to die before you accept the truth? This won't pass. It will consume us all. The elders exchanged uncertain glances. John could see it in their eyes. They knew he was right, but they were too afraid to admit it. Finally, Elias spoke again, his voice shaking. If what you say is true, how do we stop it? John straightened, his breath shallow. We must cleanse the grave. We must make amends for the wrong we've done to that boy. A cleansing ritual, something to release his spirit from this place. And if it doesn't work? Elias asked quietly. John hesitated. Then we are all lost. By nightfall, a small group of villagers had gathered at the edge of the well where the boy had been buried. John stood at the center, holding a torch, its flame wavering against the cold wind. The air felt heavier here, thick with the weight of something unseen. The villagers muttered prayers, clutching rosaries and charms as if they might protect them. Edward stood at the back, arms crossed, glaring daggers at John. This is a waste of time, he growled. John ignored him, turning to Sam, who carried a small wooden bowl filled with salt and herbs. Stay close to me, John said softly, no matter what happens. The villagers watched as John knelt beside the grave, the torchlight casting jagged shadows across the uneven earth. He sprinkled the salt and herbs in a circle around the mound, muttering prayers he hadn't spoken in decades. The villagers shivered, watching the scene unfold with bated breath. Then the wind picked up. It came suddenly, violently, as though the very earth had exhaled. The torch flames flared, and several villagers stumbled back, shielding their faces. The trees surrounding the clearing groaned, their branches twisting unnaturally. John's voice rose above the wind, louder, more desperate. Release this spirit. Let the boy find peace. The ground trembled beneath them. A deep, guttural sound echoed from somewhere far below, a sound that no human throat could have produced. And then, the whispers came. You let me die. The voice was everywhere, on the wind, in the trees, inside their heads. The villagers screamed, clutching at their ears as the sound grew louder, angrier. You let me suffer. John's hands shook as he tried to continue the ritual, but the earth beneath the grave split open with a sickening crack. From the darkness, something rose, a small figure, pale and twisted, its blind, unseen eyes fixed on John. It was Thomas. The boy's frail form hovered above the grave, his filthy rags hanging from his bony frame. His lips curled into a cruel, unnatural smile as he stretched out his hands. You cannot save them. The villagers screamed as the shadows surged, twisting into shapes that clawed at their feet and pulled them into the darkness. Edward dropped to his knees, his face pale and streaked with tears. It's not real, it's not real. John grabbed Sam, pulling him back. Run. Run. The wind howled like 1,000 voices, and the boy's laughter echoed through the clearing, a cold, hollow sound that promised nothing but suffering. The torch fell from John's hands as he and Sam fled, the fire dying as it hit the frozen earth. Behind them, the graveyard was consumed by darkness. The boy's voice rang out one last time, cutting through the screams of the villagers. You will all pay. As John ran, his heart pounding in his chest, he knew the truth. The ritual had failed. The curse had grown too strong, and the village was no longer theirs. It belonged to him now, to the boy they had let die. And the worst was yet to come. Part 7. The horrifying return. The village was dying. Ever since the failed cleansing ritual, the air had grown heavier, colder, as though an invisible weight pressed down on the land and its people. The fires burned dim, no longer providing warmth, and shadows pooled unnaturally in the corners of every room. Even at high noon, the sun refused to break through the dense veil of gray clouds, leaving everything cast in perpetual twilight. John knew the curse had grown stronger. Villagers whispered of figures glimpsed in darkened doorways, shadows that moved on their own, and cold hands brushing their shoulders when no one was there. But it was the disappearances that struck the deepest fear whole families found gone, their homes empty but untouched. John sat by the fire one evening, staring blankly into the flickering flames. His face was gaunt, his eyes ringed with deep shadows. Beside him, Sam dozed fitfully on a pile of blankets, his cheeks flushed with exhaustion. The boy hadn't slept properly in days, haunted by the voice that now seemed to follow them everywhere. "You let me die," the words crept in through cracks in the walls, hissed through the gaps beneath doors, and rose from the earth itself. It was constant, a quiet, unrelenting reminder of the sin the village had committed. John buried his face in his hands, muttering under his breath, "There must be a way. There must be something I can do." The fire crackled, its light casting tall, wavering shadows along the walls of the small cottage. The screams came first. John jolted awake to the sound of Sam's terrified cries. "Sir, he's here. He's here." John's heart lurched as he spun toward the boy. Sam was sitting upright, his face twisted with panic, pointing toward the far corner of the room. "He's here." John grabbed the lantern and fumbled to light it, his hands trembling so violently that the match nearly snapped. The flame flared to life, casting weak light into the room. At first, John saw nothing but darkness in the frantic shadows of their own movements. "Sam, calm down. There's nothing." His words froze in his throat. The corner of the room was wrong. At the edge of the lantern's glow, the darkness seemed deeper, thicker, as though it had taken on form. Slowly, something began to emerge from it. A shape. Small. Crawling. John's breath hitched as his mind tried to process what he was seeing. It was him. The blind boy Thomas dragged himself from the shadows, his frail, pale limbs moving unnaturally. His hands clawed at the wooden floor, nails scraping loudly against the planks. His face was contorted, blank white eyes staring directly at John and Sam, though they were blind. The corners of his cracked mouth twisted into something like a grin, empty, cruel, and full of malice. "You let me die," the boy whispered, his voice carrying on the air like a snake's hiss. John stumbled backward, knocking over the lantern. The flame sputtered and died, plunging the room into darkness once again. Sam screamed, clutching at John's arm. "Sir, he's coming." The scraping sound grew louder, closer, nails on wood, deliberate and steady. It was all John could hear as the chill of the room became unbearable, seeping through his skin and into his bones. "Get up, Sam," John shouted, grabbing the boy's arm and yanking him to his feet. "But he's—" "Run," John roared, shoving Sam toward the door. They burst into the night, the freezing air hitting them like a wall of ice. Behind them, the scraping sound continued, followed by a slow, guttural laugh that didn't sound like it belonged to the boy or to anything human. John glanced back as they ran, his breath catching in his throat. The cottage was cloaked in shadow, but the door remained open, and just inside he saw Thomas. The boy was crawling toward the threshold, his movements jerky and unnatural. His face turned toward John, and even from a distance he could see the boy's lips moving. "You will never escape." John turned away, forcing his legs to move faster as he and Sam fled through the darkened village. The village square was chaos. As John and Sam stumbled forward, the air was filled with screams, horrible, blood-curdling cries that echoed off the walls of the houses. Doors were slamming, windows shattering, and through it all, John could hear that same voice. "You let me die." Figures darted through the shadows, villagers running aimlessly, their faces twisted in terror. John saw Edward staggering near the fountain, his mouth moving soundlessly as he clutched his head. Behind him, something small and pale dragged itself from the shadows, moving with a predatory calm. "Edward!" John shouted, but the man didn't respond. He simply collapsed to his knees, his face frozen in a silent scream as the shadows swallowed him whole. "Keep moving," John shouted, pulling Sam toward the edge of the village. "We have to get to the forest," Sam gasped between sobs, his legs barely keeping up. "The forest? We can't go in there." "We don't have a choice," John snapped. It's the only place left. They ran past abandoned homes, past fields left untended, and into the dark mouth of the forest. The trees loomed like twisted sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky. John didn't stop until they were deep inside, far from the village. The screams had faded into silence, and the cold was suffocating now. He and Sam collapsed against the trunk of a tree, both gasping for breath. What is happening? Sam stammered, tears streaming down his face. John's hands were shaking as he wiped sweat from his brow. The curse. It's taken everything. The village is now from somewhere in the darkness. A faint whisper reached them. You can't hide, Sam whimpered, clutching John's arm tightly. He's here. Sir, he's here. John turned sharply, his lantern trembling in his grip. The forest was still, deathly quiet, but he could feel the presence of something watching them, waiting. Slowly, the shadows beneath the trees began to shift. A small figure stepped forward into the edge of the light. It was Thomas. But this time, he was different. His pale skin was stretched thin over his bones, his blind eyes wide and gleaming. His mouth hung open in a grotesque grin, revealing jagged, blackened teeth. You let me die, the words echoed through the forest, layered and distorted, as though 100 voices were speaking at once. John grabbed Sam's hand, yanking him to his feet. Run. Go deeper into the woods. Sam stumbled after him, his cries barely audible over the pounding of their feet against the earth. The boys' laughter followed them, rising and falling like a chorus of whispers. The ground seemed to tremble with every step, and the trees groaned as though alive, their branches reaching down to trap them. John pushed forward, his heart thundering in his chest. He didn't know where they were going, only that they couldn't stop. The boy's voice rang louder, closer, its words sharp and cold. You will never escape. You will all pay. Suddenly, the earth gave way beneath John's feet. He cried out, tumbling down a steep incline, dragging Sam with him. They landed hard at the bottom, coughing and gasping for air. The lantern had shattered, leaving them in total darkness. Sam, John whispered hoarsely. Are you hurt? I'm okay, the boy stammered. Where are we? John looked up, his chest tightening. Above them, the trees were dense, the sky hidden completely. And in the silence, he heard it again, soft, dragging footsteps moving closer. John pulled Sam into his arms, his voice shaking as he whispered, Don't look. Don't listen. The boy's voice drifted down to them. Closer now, his laughter soft and hollow. You let me die. And now, I will never let you go. And from the darkness, something crawled toward them. Part 8. The village's fall. The forest was deathly silent. Only the sound of John's and Sam's ragged breathing broke through the oppressive stillness. The air was so cold it burned their lungs, and the ground beneath them was damp and lifeless. The trees, ancient and gnarled, loomed above them like dark sentinels, their twisted branches blotting out what little light remained. John sat against the base of an enormous oak tree, his arms wrapped protectively around Sam, whose small body trembled uncontrollably. Their descent down the slope had left them bruised and dirty, but they were alive for now. What happened to them? Sir Sam stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. John didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was still reeling from what they had seen, the villagers, their once familiar faces now blank and hollow, their bodies twisted into unnatural stillness. And behind it all, standing at the heart of the village square, was the blind beggar boy Thomas, or what was left of him. John shivered, remembering the way the boy had stood there, small and frail yet commanding a presence so dark it seemed to bleed into the very air around him. The boy's pale, lifeless face had turned to them before they fled, his blind eyes unseeing but somehow knowing. You let me die, the whisper echoed in John's mind, gnawing at him like a blade to the soul. Sam pulled closer to him, his small fingers clinging to John's coat. We can't go back there. They're gone, aren't they? All of them. John tightened his grip on the boy. We'll stay here, Sam. Just for a while. Until it's safe. But even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. The hours dragged on, and the day faded into an unnatural twilight. Neither of them dared to move lest they draw the attention of whatever force had taken hold of the village. Finally, the quiet broke not with birdsong or the creak of branches, but with a sound so faint it almost went unnoticed: soft footsteps. John's blood turned to ice. He motioned for Sam to stay still, holding his breath as he peered through the dense undergrowth. The forest edge lay not far ahead, giving them a view of the village below, and what they saw froze them to the core. The villagers were standing there, gathered in the square like puppets with their strings cut. Men, women, even children, all of them stood perfectly still, their faces blank and expressionless, their eyes wide and unblinking. Their bodies were twisted unnaturally, some hunched, others standing on legs bent at sickening angles. "They're not alive," Sam whispered, his voice cracking. "They can't be." John couldn't answer. His heart thundered in his chest as he watched. None of the villagers moved, but their presence felt suffocating, as though the square itself had become a single, pulsing entity of dread. And there, at the center of it all, was him. Thomas stood atop the ruined well, his small form stark against the darkness that clung to the village. His blind, milky eyes seemed to sweep over the crowd, though he could not see. His lips moved silently, murmuring words that no living ear could understand. As John watched, a faint sound reached him, soft, rhythmic, and chilling. It was coming from the villagers. Their mouths, though slack and hollow, were moving. "They're chanting," John whispered, a sick realization dawning on him. "He's making them chant." The words were incoherent at first, rising and falling in a terrible, unnatural harmony. But as the sound grew louder, John began to understand. "You let me die." The phrase repeated over and over, each word punctuated with a sense of malice that seemed to darken the sky itself. The air vibrated with the sound, heavy with despair and anger. The ground beneath John and Sam trembled faintly, as though the earth itself recoiled at what was happening. Suddenly, one of the villagers moved. John's breath caught as a man, Reuben, the farmer, stepped forward, his body jerking like a marionette. His limbs moved in stiff, unnatural motions, his head lolling to one side. He staggered toward the center of the square and fell to his knees before the boy. The chanting stopped. For a moment, there was silence, thick and oppressive. Then Thomas raised one bony hand and pointed a finger at the kneeling man. A sound like 1,000 whispers erupted from the air, swirling around the square. Reuben let out a strangled gasp as his body convulsed, his eyes wide with terror. "No," John whispered hoarsely, though he knew Reuben could not hear him. The man's screams filled the square, but they were quickly swallowed by the sound of the whispers. His body shuddered violently, and then horribly he fell still, his head lolling forward. From where John stood, he could see Reuben's face empty, pale, and lifeless. One by one, other villagers stepped forward, their movements stiff and jerking. They knelt before Thomas as the whispers rose again, louder this time, an invisible chorus of torment and pain. And one by one, they fell, their bodies joining the ever-growing crowd of the cursed. "They're giving themselves to him," John said, his voice trembling. Sam clutched at John's sleeve, his face pale and streaked with tears. Why? Why are they doing that?" John shook his head. "They aren't doing it willingly. He's taken them. They're his now." Sam began to sob, burying his face in John's shoulder. "Why won't he stop?" John closed his eyes, his heart breaking as he listened to the whispers rise and fall like a dark tide. "Because we let him die, Sam. And now, he's making us pay for it." Hours passed, though it felt like days. The entire village had fallen under the boys' control, their bodies still and silent, their lives extinguished by the dark force that lingered in Thomas's twisted soul. Night fell over the forest, though it brought no peace. The village below glowed faintly in the moonlight, and the boy's presence remained palpable, as though his power was spreading outward, inching closer to the forest. John sat motionless, his back against the tree, his arms wrapped around Sam. The boy had finally fallen asleep, his small frame shivering with every breath. John stared at the village, exhaustion and dread weighing on him like a leaden shroud. How did it come to this? He wondered. How had the sins of a single moment led to such devastation? They had ignored the boy's suffering. They had mocked him, abandoned him, and buried him like an animal. And now he had come back not as a boy, but as a force of darkness that consumed everything in its path. John closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his cheek. "I'm sorry, Thomas," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." The wind picked up then, carrying with it the faint sound of laughter, soft, hollow, and unmistakably the boy's. John's eyes snapped open, his heart pounding. He looked down at Sam, who stirred restlessly, his face contorted in a frown. Then John heard it again, closer this time. "You can't hide," the voice carried through the trees, soft but certain, a promise of what was to come. John held Sam tighter, his eyes darting toward the darkened woods. He knew it was only a matter of time before the boy found them. The village had fallen, and now the forest would follow. Part 9. The legend remains. Days had passed since the night the village fell, though for John and Sam, time had lost all meaning. From their place deep in the forest, they watched as an unnatural glow rose on the horizon, the faint red light of fires consuming what remained of the village. Smoke billowed into the sky, thick and black, spreading like a dark stain across the heavens. No birds sang, no animals stirred. The forest was as silent as the grave. John sat slumped against the roots of an ancient tree, his face gaunt and hollowed by exhaustion. Sam lay beside him, his head resting on John's lap, his small body finally still after days of running and hiding. The boy had cried himself to sleep, and John had nothing left to offer, no reassurances, no promises that they were safe. Because they weren't. The wind, ever present and biting, carried with it a faint whisper, "You let me die." It never stopped. John's mind wandered as he stared at the distant village. He remembered the fields, once golden and lush, where farmers toiled from sunrise to dusk. The square where children laughed and played, and where neighbors gossiped by the fountain. He thought of the temple, now ash, and the villagers, men and women who had once seemed so strong, reduced to puppets in the hands of an unrelenting curse. And he thought of the boy, Thomas, the frail, blind beggar they had all abandoned. The boy who had stumbled into their midst, his body broken and his spirit battered, only to be met with cruelty. He had come to them for salvation, and instead, they had given him damnation. "You let me die." John's chest tightened, a dull ache spreading through him. "We did this," he whispered hoarsely. All of us. Sam stirred, his voice barely audible. "Sir, what's going to happen now?" John looked down at the boy, his heart breaking at the fear etched into Sam's young face. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we can't go back. There's nothing left." Sam sat up, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "What about the others? Is everyone gone?" John hesitated, his throat dry. "Yes," he said finally. "The village is gone, Sam." A gust of wind swept through the trees then, cold and sharp, carrying with it the faintest sound of someone laughing. John flinched, his eyes darting toward the darkness between the trees. For a moment he thought he saw movement, a small, pale figure at the edge of his vision, but when he looked directly, there was nothing. Still, the laughter lingered, soft and hollow. Days later, travelers passing through the area found the village in ruins. What remained of the buildings, houses, barns, the council hall were nothing more than charred skeletons, their frames blackened and crumbling. The fields were scorched, the crops turned to ash, as if some great fire had swept through and devoured everything. But there were no bodies. Not a single trace of the villagers remained. It was as though they had been plucked from the earth, leaving only their homes to burn in their absence. The village, well, once a source of life, now stood as its center a gaping hole, surrounded by scorched ground. Locals who dared approach swore they could feel the chill radiating from it, a cold that didn't belong to this world. Some claimed they saw shapes in the smoke, twisting shadows of people long gone, their faces blank, their bodies broken. Others said they heard whispers carried on the wind, faint and distant, but unmistakably real. "You let me die, you will all pay." The words seemed to come from the depths of the forgotten well itself. where the earth was dark and deep. The brave or foolish who ventured closer said that at night, when the wind was still, you could see him. The boy, Thomas, standing by the well, his pale form barely visible in the gloom. They described his milky white eyes, wide and empty, and his cracked lips that curved into an unnatural smile. He didn't move. He didn't speak. But if you listened closely, you could hear him whisper. The village soon became a forbidden place, its ruins avoided by all but the most reckless of wanderers. The ground was cursed, the locals said, and to step there was to invite the boys' wrath. They spoke of travelers who didn't heed the warnings, who entered the village and never returned. The legend spread. It was passed from village to village, generation to generation, as a tale meant to frighten children and keep them obedient. Parents warned their sons and daughters, be kind to those in need. Never turn away the desperate or mock the weak. For cruelty breeds curses, and curses cannot be silenced. The story of the blind beggar boy became a dark parable, a warning that the sins of cruelty and neglect would not go unpunished. The boy's whispers became a reminder, a ghostly echo of his suffering. You let me die, you will all pay. Years later, long after the village had been forgotten, the legend remained. Travelers passing through the woods would sometimes speak of strange happenings, of shadows moving where no one stood, of cold winds that whispered names, and of a boy's faint laughter drifting through the trees. One man, an old wanderer with stories etched into every line of his face, claimed he had seen the well with his own eyes. It's still there, he told those who would listen. A black pit, deeper than any well I've ever seen. And it's not empty. Something waits there. What did you see? Someone asked him. The man's face went pale. His hands trembled. I didn't see him, but I heard what the man looked up. His voice barely a whisper. You will all pay. John's name, like the village, faded into obscurity. He and Sam were never heard from again, though some speculated that they had escaped far away, trying to outrun the boy's curse. Others said they had succumbed to it, lost to the shadows that now haunted the land. But the truth remained buried with the village, swallowed by fire and time. Only the legend lived on, whispered on dark nights when the wind howled through the trees. And for those who dared wander too close to the place where the village once stood, there was always the same warning: stay away from the well. Don't listen to the whispers. And if you hear the boy's voice, run. Because Thomas still waits, and his whispers, carried by the wind, are forever etched into the silence. You let me die, you will all pay.